Hi, I'm Bjarne Vonsild and I'm a teacher trainer. I'm going to, in this video, give you some tips on how to get the most out of the CELTA course. So in this video, I'm going to talk about what is the CELTA, who's the CELTA for, what not to do in teaching practice, what to do instead, how to get the most out of the theoretical part, the assessment of the course, meaning how is the course assessed, and which books do we recommend for doing the course. So what is the CELTA course? Well, the CELTA course is the best known teacher training qualification for English teachers of adults. And who is it for? Well, there are various reasons for doing the CELTA, but it's mainly for people who want to break into the teaching profession, people who have no experience of teaching. It's also for experienced teachers who would like to develop further in their career and who want to make sure that what they're doing is in line with good practices. And of course, they want to extend their repertoire. And thirdly, it is for people who want to get an internationally recognized certificate so that they can not only teach in their own country and get a better job maybe, but also so they can teach in other countries almost anywhere in the world. Now, the CELTA course is challenging, but why is it challenging? Well, it's not as if the information is that difficult to grasp. It's just that there's a lot to take in. Because being a teacher is not just about being able to speak the language well. It's about so many other things, such as you're going to learn about the learning teaching process. You're going to learn about aspects of pronunciation and how to clarify it to students, how to develop the 4 skills: reading, writing, speaking, listening, how to clarify grammar and pronunciation, and classroom management skills, and many more things as well. So this makes the course quite challenging, but in this video you're going to get some tips on how to best deal with all this information, how to get the most out of the teaching practice part, and how to prepare yourself for the theoretical part of the course. Now, the CELTA course is a Cambridge English assessment course. That means that the criteria that are used are stipulated by Cambridge University. So the tips I'm going to give you are based on 25 years of experience and the criteria set out by Cambridge. Now, the first thing we're going to talk about is teaching practice. And this is where I'm going to give you the first piece of advice for doing well on this course. During the course, you're going to teach lessons to real students and you're going to get feedback on what you do. And it's very important that when you get feedback on your teaching, that in the following lesson, you try to react to this feedback and implement the new information that you've been given. So if you keep reacting to the feedback and implementing it in the next lesson, this is a very good way forward. It'll guarantee that you keep developing. Now, it could be, or sometimes we have trainees who have a lot of experience, who are a little bit reluctant to take on the feedback and implement it. Why? Because, and this is quite understandable, they've been teaching for a long time and they know from experience that what they've been doing works. But that doesn't mean that what the information that they're given by their tutors doesn't work as well. And it could be that this is an amazing opportunity for learning how to do something in a different way, or maybe even better. So I keep saying, wherever you're coming from, whatever your experience is, try to implement what you learn. We don't do courses in order to just confirm that we are good at something. we do courses to learn new things. So keep developing, keep implementing what you learn. So I said before, we're going to talk about the practical part, and I'm going to give you tips on what not to do, and obviously on what you can do instead. And the first such tip is called don't echo. What I mean by don't echo, there is a tendency for teachers, of all sorts of teachers and ranges of experience, to repeat what students say. Maybe it's a habit that ensures that everybody hears it, or kind of confirmation that you understood it, but in actual fact, it may not be a very productive habit. What I mean is that if you as a teacher repeat everything that's important that the students say, what's going to happen is, one, the students might wonder if they're being corrected and what they said was wrong. But secondly, and more importantly, it could be that if you repeat everything, the students will stop listening to each other because everything is being repeated by the teacher anyway. And we want to create a learning environment where students work together collectively and they listen to each other. So if you're in doubt about whether other students heard what one student said, ask another student, did you hear what he said? And if not, ask the person who said it initially to repeat it, not for you, but for his peer in the classroom. There's another theory there, is that if you repeat something that the student said, and the student might be quite proud that they came up with, let's say, a new word, that if you repeat what they say, you take away a bit of their sense of achievement. So instead of repeating it, celebrate it. Acknowledge that you heard it, that it was good, without necessarily repeating it. The second tip is don't explain grammar or vocabulary for that sake. What I mean is, of course, there's a tendency to explain because we think that that's what teachers do. But on the CELTA course, you actually encourage not to. So this thing of, we say you shouldn't have done something to express criticism of past actions. So it's subject plus should plus have plus past participle to criticize past actions. That was my explanation. The problem with explanations is that when we explain, there's very little to go by in terms of knowing what the students actually understood. And there is no involvement by the students in the learning when you explain. I think it's important that we remember that language has to be clarified through a context. So instead of explaining, use a situation, use a picture, use an anecdote, a story from an anecdote to elicit the target language from the students. So you might have a story of somebody who did something really wrong, and then ask the students to tell you how you could comment on that. And then see if the students come up with he or she shouldn't have done something. And when and only when you have tried to elicit it from the students and they're not coming up with it, then you give them the target phrase that you want them to learn. After that, you can ask more questions to check if they really understood the sentence, you shouldn't have, let's say, shouted at the policeman or something like that. So when it comes to vocabulary or grammar, whatever you do, try not to explain. Language has to be clarified through a context. My third piece of advice is don't praise willy-nilly. What does that mean? Don't praise without really emphasizing why you're praising. There is a tendency for teachers to overpraise, meaning kind of habitually saying, great, well done, good job, great guys. But these little phrases very often just become repeated phrases. And if you repeat them a lot and it's always the same thing, students stop noticing them and they become background noise. So if you're going to praise somebody on their performance, make it specific. What is it that the person did that is praisable, that is noteworthy, right? So you might tell students, really nice how you pronounce the TH sound in that word, or really good use of the grammar in this activity. But try to make a point out of saying what it is that was good and not just praise without thinking about it, so it becomes empty praise. The fourth tip is don't test your students' memory when developing their reading and listening skills. What do I mean by that? Well, there is a tendency for teachers to provide a text for students to read or listen to, and afterwards pose questions to them about the content of the text. But in this way, students don't have a reason or purpose for reading or listening in the first place. In real life, when we read something, we normally have a reason for picking up a book or a magazine. It's something that we already know something about, we've heard about it, we're curious about it, or we're picking up the book because we're doing something professionally or academically that requires certain information. So when we pick up a text in real life, we already have a purpose. We know what we're looking for. So in an English class, it should be the same. The fact that the teacher gives you a text that you have to read and then answer questions on, that's not purpose enough. So you need to, as a teacher, provide interest in the text, provide a task for them to do while reading and listening, so that they have a reason for doing the activity. Otherwise, when you give the questions afterwards, you're not really developing their reading, listening skills. You are merely testing their memory. So we don't know if their inability to answer a question is because they forgot or because they didn't understand. Now, the fifth tip for you is don't overdo whole class discussions. I know it's lovely to talk to everybody and have a chat, but remember it's a language class and you want to facilitate that students speak. So when you've got whole class discussions and you've got 10 students, each student will only contribute maximum 10% of the time. So instead, make a lot of use of pair work. That gives 50% talking time, doesn't it? Group work with 3 or 4 students, but hand over for students to talk between them rather than whole class discussions. The fifth tip is avoid, if you are going to develop students' reading skills for comprehension, avoid having students read aloud. Why? Well, there are several good reasons. One is it's not really natural to read aloud unless you've got small children. But more importantly, when students read aloud, especially when they read aloud in another language, the tendency is to focus on pronunciation. And what happens then is that they very often don't really understand what they read because they were focusing so much on pronunciation. But the whole point of reading, isn't it, to understand what you're reading? So there's a whole contradiction there. So if your aim is to develop reading skills, students should read naturally, quietly. And the other thing is that for English, more than maybe any other language, the difference between the way things are written, the spelling, is very different from the way we pronounce words. So spelling can negatively interfere with pronunciation. You can use reading aloud for developing students' pronunciation, but in that case, they would first need to read silently to know what they're reading. Secondly, they would need to hear the text being read aloud by you or a recording. And then they could analyze features of pronunciation and then, and only then, read aloud. I personally don't actually have students read aloud ever. I do work with pronunciation, but not through reading aloud. It doesn't help me much. Now, the 7th tip is don't spoon feed. And what do I mean by that? I mean, don't tell and don't explain if you can get students to tell you. Because if you're giving information or explaining things, chances are that they are not actually getting the information, and you have very little to go by. There's very little telling you how much they understood when you're talking at them. And more importantly, when you're talking at them or explaining, they're not involved. And remember, we want students to be involved in their own learning process. So instead of explaining, if you want students to learn vocabulary, maybe they can deduce the meaning of vocabulary from a text or a sentence. If you're going to clarify how to organize a text, maybe you should give them an example of a well-organized text, and they can themselves discover how it was organized, you using questions to prompt them in the right direction. If it's for reading, maybe they can discover the topic sentence in a text and learn where that is in order to become more effective readers. And with grammar, the same thing. They can discover grammar in context, not have you explain it, because that's not really your function, just to give information. If you just want them to have information, they could buy a grammar book or a dictionary, right? But you're going to make them more independent learners so that they can discover the language. My 8th tip is don't be the center of attention in the class. Remember, the class is for the students. So we should try to let them be the main actors in the class. So instead of you being the center of attention, you can make ample use of group work, pair work. When you are teaching in a face-to-face class, try not to stand up unless you're using the board. You can sit down most of the time. Try to, when students give you information or ask for information, not necessarily immediately react, but see if other students can contribute or help give that information. When you're monitoring online, you can turn off your camera so that you stay in the background a bit when they're working. So try to deflect the attention so that students are focusing on each other and they are cooperating with each other during the class. My 9th tip is don't clarify language indiscriminately. What do I mean? In life and in English classes, if we try to do too many things, we end up very often not doing anything very well. So when you're teaching a class, always keep the main aim of your lesson in mind. Sure, you're going to respond to questions students make that are not related to the target language. You may use or correct stuff that they say that are not related to the class on that day. But try not to sidetrack too much. Try not to over-clarify things that are not relevant to the class at hand. Sometimes if there's a big question, so a question that is difficult to answer in a short time and is not part of your main aim, then you might say, okay, we're going to deal with that later. But keep your focus on your main aim so that students walk away from each class knowing one thing or something better than when they arrived. And so that after the class, they have a clear idea of what it is that they learned. Now, we have gone over 9 tips for how you can better prepare yourselves and get the most out of the CELTA teaching practice. Now, we're going over to talk about how you can prepare yourself in more general terms and specifically for the theoretical part. Now, when the course starts, or actually before the course starts, we like to prepare our trainees by providing them with what we call a pre-course task. And that pre-course task is incredibly important. The pre-course task consists of questions or tasks related to language learning and to language. And by doing this task, you will find some of the gaps that you have in terms of knowledge of teaching and grammar and even lexis and pronunciation. So we also send with the task the answers so that you can kind of test yourself, see what your gaps are, and know what it is that you need to focus on the course mainly. So an incredibly useful tool for gauging what you need to learn. And this takes me over to the theoretical part. So how can you prepare yourself for the theoretical part? We first of all suggest two books. They both cover the theory of the course itself. They also overlap, so you wouldn't need to read both of them. So the titles are The Practice of English Language Teaching by Jeremy Harmer and Learning Teaching by Jim Scrivener. So remember, you don't have to read both of them because they overlap a bit in knowledge. Of course you can. Now you might ask, well, do I have to read this book? Well, it's not obligatory, but really you are going to find it incredibly helpful and you're going to be able to focus much more on the practical teaching part if you have read up on the theory. So you don't have to deal with both so much during the course. So I very strongly or highly recommend you read at least one of these books. And then the question of preparing yourself for the language, meaning just because you speak English, it doesn't mean you can teach it. So we need the pedagogy of the course, but we also need to study the language in more depth, meaning, for example, do you know the grammar of English? So for you to get a better grasp of the grammar that you do not know how to clarify, that you do not really understand how it works, then we also recommend books. Remember, I mentioned before the pre-course task that helps you decide on some of the grammar points that you need to focus on. But let's go back to what you can do. So again, we recommend two books. One of them is by Swan, and the other one is by Martin Parrott. Again, you don't need both of them, but these two books, one or the other, are incredibly useful, especially when it comes to your lesson planning, when you need to make sure that you know how to clarify the grammar that you're going to teach. So bear in mind, these two books are not grammar books for students. They are specifically grammar books for teachers. I know that a lot of you probably have Grammar in Use, which is a very sold book, but it's a grammar book for students. So one of these two books would be really helpful. Now, even after trainees have gone through the application process, they have received information from the school about the course, they have had their pre-course interview during which they had an opportunity to ask questions to the tutor who interviewed them, and they were given more information about the course. Unfortunately, experience has shown that there's still people who are in doubt about what they have to do on the course. So we get this question, well, I didn't know I had to do this, or I didn't know I would have to do that. Now, in order for you to make sure that you really have all the information that you need to know about what is going to happen on the course, I've written an ebook. In this ebook, I go over every part of the course that you are going to work with. So I'm going to go over the teaching practice, the input you're going to get, and what is actually going to happen when it comes to assignments. So look in the description and find the link to my ebook giving you more information on what happens on the CELTA course. The next topic we're going to talk about, I mentioned briefly before, is the assignments. the written assignments. During the course, you're going to write 4 assignments. And the assignments are really relevant to what you're going to do teaching-wise. It's about analyzing language. It's about analyzing students' needs and providing for those. It's about developing a lesson from a text. And it's about reflection on the course. These 4 topics will be covered in these assignments. Now, one of the things that we find is that very often trainees have to resubmit because there's something missing in answering the criteria of the course. And the main one is that when you're writing the essays, you have to use reference to reading you have done to support whatever you write. And remember, I recommended the books before. You can refer to those. So you need to make reference to reading to back up what you write. So make sure you do this in your written assignments. Now, the 4 written assignments are not great big pieces of work. It's 1,000 words. So the other thing to watch out for, don't go over the 1,000 words. It's quite doable. Now, the last thing we're going to talk about is the grading or the assessment. So on the course, there are the grades pass, A and B. Now be careful, this getting a B or an A grade is not mathematics. It's not as if, oh, I've got 4 above standard lessons and my assignments were all passed on first submission, so I should be a B. So what we do when we assess your performance on the course, sure, we do look carefully at the directly assessed parts like the written assignments and the written work. But remember, we also take into considerations other factors that are really important for being an effective teacher, such as professionalism. That means arriving on time, starting lessons on time, handing in coursework on time, interacting with the staff of the school, interacting with the students before and during and after lessons, your relationship with tutors and peers. So generally, we look at what will this trainee be like as an employee, as an asset to a school after doing the course. So we're looking at the whole picture. We call this holistic assessment. And sometimes people get disappointed when they get a pass. Well, remember that a pass on a course like this is no little thing, right? Because a pass on this course means that you can give English lessons effectively, that you can walk into a classroom independently and prepare your own lessons for that. And for you to be able to do that, that is already very difficult. So a pass on the CELTA course, I guess pass is a bit of a misnomer because a pass is very good indeed. A B is an above standard grade. So it is rarer people get a B, but it's possible if you do the work, if you put in the effort, sure it is. And sure is an A is possible as possible. So what have we been talking about so far? Now, we've been talking about teaching practice and what not to do and what to do instead. We've talked about what you can do before the course starts in terms of reading up on theory and on language. We talked about the theoretical part in general and what the CELTA course covers and who it is for. I mentioned some books as well that are very useful for you. We talked about the assignments and we mentioned the assessment on the course. Now, all of these tips I've given you, I'm sure will stand you in good stead when and if you do the CELTA course. The whole point of this video is that you get the most out of the course and that you perform your best. So good luck with everything. Thank you for listening. Bye now.